This is the Daily Items One-on-One. Our guest today is Sunbury native and founder of the Clean Stream Act, Franklin Kury, interviewed by Justin Strawser.
Welcome to a special edition of One-on-One. Today we have with us Sunbury native Franklin Kury, who served as a Democrat in the State House of Representatives from 1966 to 1972 for the 108th District, and in the State Senate from 1972 to 1980 for the 27th District. He was a leader in the enactment of environmental laws, such as the Clean Stream Act, that are seen as the culmination of the environmental revolution that marked the end of the exploitation of the state's natural resources. He was the author and lead advocate for the environmental amendment to the state constitution that declares a right to a clean environment by the people and makes the state government the trustee of public natural resources. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Kury.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Justin.
Now, the reason we have you here is on May 18th, we marked the 50th anniversary of the passing of the environmental rights. Is that correct?
That's true. On May 18th, 1971, the voters approved the amendment, which is required of every constitutional amendment.
I have the Article 1, Section 27 words here. I'm going to read them to you. I'm sure you have them memorized, but
Well, I have. Okay.
For those who might be listening that might not know, the amendment says the people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all people, including generations yet to come. As trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all people. So that's what it says. But let's talk about 1971, Mr. Kury. What were the environmental circumstances that led to the need for this?
Well, first of all, in 1971 was the culmination of the public reaction to the century of brazen exploitation of our state's natural resources by the coal companies, the railroad companies, and the steel companies. In fact, they had brazenly used the streams to dispose of their waste and leaving acres and acres of mine waste and large flag piles and so on. The people were really upset by it. I'll never forget in 1965, the Barnes and Tucker Coal Company in Cambria County let loose a large discharge of acid mine drainage that went down the west branch of the Susquehanna, and it took a week for it to get down to Sunbury, but when it did, people saw that it killed fish by the thousands. It was stunning. So people were very, very fed up by it. And so the legislature became the fulcrum or the point of doing something about it. And what we did in 1966, I was elected to the House of Representatives from Sunbury. I defeated the incumbent, who was the senior Republican in the House, who had voted against bringing coal companies under the Clean Streams Law. The coal companies had been exempted from every Clean Streams law since the first one in 1905. So I ran on that issue. That's when that famous picture of me and the 2 jars of water was taken to dramatize the issue. And so when I got to the legislature in 1967, my first term, yeah, that's a picture of me. That's the picture that was taken.
Yeah, it's the one you're just referencing.
Yeah, it was my wife's idea. We went down to 10th Street in Sunbury, on a bridge over Shamokin Creek, and I took in my left hand, I took that jar and put it into the surface of the water and filled it up. I didn't add anything to it or subtract. I just took it like that and brought it home, put the top on it, and we took the jar of water from our kitchen sink, and that's how we took the picture. But that got me into the House of Representatives. And what happened when I got there was, in 1969, I became the secretary to the House Conservation Committee. There were John Ladadia was our chairman, I was the secretary, and there were 12 of us from both parties on this committee. And we processed in 4 years more environmental legislation than in the entire history of the state. We passed a clean streams law, clean air law. We passed a mine land disposal law. We passed a waste management law. We passed about a dozen laws like that. And in the middle of that, it occurred to me, these are only statutes. Statutes can be repealed almost as easily as they can be enacted.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, we need something more permanent. And that's when, and one day reading the New York Times, I saw New York had a constitutional amendment to its environmental protection law. That was a different law altogether because it mainly protected, New York was concerned about its forest lands. But I said, why not something like that in Pennsylvania, but broader in scope? So what I did was take that idea, put together some idea. One of the ideas I got was from Bessie Beck, who at that time was a co-owner of the Sunbury Daily Item, and wrote a column called Up and Down the River, in which he advocated that Susquehanna River belonged to everybody. Well, when I drew up the dilemma, I said, not only the river, but also the air and a lot of other things belong to the public, to public natural resources. So I put it in 1969, and it passed the legislature that year, but with 4 amendments. There are several amendments to my version, but anyhow, on April 14th, 1970, the bill came back from the Senate with some amendments in it, and the Speaker of the House, Herbert Feynman, designated that day as Earth Day, the first Earth Day in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. And we had as our guest speaker, Gaylord Nelson, the senator from Wisconsin, who is the father of the idea of Earth Day. And he was going around the country making speeches to promote Earth Day. Earth Day was April 20th, 1970, but he couldn't do each state more than 1 or 2 a day. Anyhow, April the 14th was his day in Pennsylvania.
Right.
So on that day, I moved to adopt the Senate amendments to my bill. It was approved unanimously. And then a few minutes later, Gaylord Nelson spoke and gave a very nice speech, his great speech on why we needed Earth Day and why we've got to do something about it. So that's how we got to it. The next year, I had to reintroduce it because, constitutional amendments require 2 sessions of the legislature in identical form. So in January of 1971, I reintroduced it. We passed both houses very quickly. It was on the ballot in May 18th, 1971, with 4 other amendments. And to the proposed amendment proposal. So the result was the Environmental Bill of Rights passed 1,000,000 to 250,000, 4 to 1, a huge margin. Women's rights passed 2 to 1. And I kid my wife that that's something that women's rights only got 2 to 1. Anyhow, I don't mean to minimize it, because of course women's rights are terribly important, and I strongly support them. But there were 3 other amendments. One of them barely passed, and 2 were defeated. So it shows you the public was looking at these amendments. They didn't just get down the line and vote yes, no. They picked it out ones they wanted. They did the right things. That's how it happened.
It feels like pretty forward thinking, for 50 years ago. How did you end up on that side of the environmental fight? What ignited your passion? What pushed you down that path?
Well, I've always been interested in the outdoors. I was in Boy Scouts. I was a Boy Scout in Troop 307 there at Presbyterian Church in Sunbury. And I was one of the few people in the troop for whom bird study was an easy merit badge. And I had some interest in it. I taught nature at the Boy Scout camp at Corundon up in Millmont. So I've been interested. But what really ignited me when I came back to Sunbury as a lawyer, Bessie Beck stopped by and asked if I would volunteer to give him some voluntary legal services on House Bill 585, which was to bring the coal companies under the Clean Streams Law, the one we referred to earlier. So I did a lot of research in that, and I went around with Bassett. He made speeches. I just listened, but he made a lot of speeches about the river and that. That really ignited me. And when the incumbent, Adam Bauer, voted no, Mr. Beck said to me, Franklin, he was really furious. Bessie Beck was furious, and Bauer voted no. He said, you run for the legislature, and I'll head your campaign. And that's what happened. I ran. He was the chairman of the Citizens for Kury, and we won.
And as a Sunbury native, you grew up then around that river, the Sunbury river town.
And Smoking Creek, yeah.
So
I know how bad Smoking Creek was. Let me say something else about being in Sunbury. When I was practicing law, I did a lot of title searches there at the courthouse, right across from the Daily Item. And one day I was doing a title search for a property in Coltmont, which, as you know, was between Shamokin and Mount Carmel.
Right.
And I found the deed from a Shamokin and Pottsville Railroad Company to Monroe Culp, the founder of Coltmont. And in that deed, the railroad was for 95 acres. In that deed, the coal company reserved to itself the right to discharge into the waters of Shamokin Creek forever the waste from its mine operations. That was stunning, to the arrogance of all that. Well, that shows you why Shamokin Creek was so dark.
Right.
1966, when I went down and took that jar of water.
Now you talked a little bit about, there was a lot of public outcry for some of these things. You mentioned Barnes and Tucker Coal Company, and it passed 4-1, on May 18th. What kind of pushback was there, and how did you navigate that?
Well, there wasn't much of a pushback because people realized, well, the legislature this was a strong, the environmental tide in Pennsylvania was on the rise. Everybody in Harrisburg knew that. That's why I didn't get there was not a negative vote on my amendment in either house. And that was because the environmental tide was never higher. Now, they did examine it, and they did make 4 amendments to it. Nothing that destroyed or undermined it, but it perfected it. For example, one of the amendments was suggested by Dr. Maurice Goddard, who was then the Secretary of Environmental Protection. He thought the word preserve in my draft was too rigid, and ought to say conserve. So the Senate changed it to conserve. Things like that happen.
Okay.
That I had no problem with. That's good. That's what legislatures should do. They looked at it. It was very carefully examined, but again, there wasn't a single negative vote from anybody in either side of the House, and all 4 times it was voted on.
Do you think you'd find that sort of support today?
That's a good question. I doubt that there would be, for a couple of reasons. First, the environmental crisis we face today is the crisis of climate change. And that's not as apparent or as dramatic as the Barnes and Tucker coal slug coming down the West Branch. Everybody could see that when the coal slug got to Williamsport, the paper headlines were "Coal slug hits Williamsport." Came to Milton, the Milton Standard paper up there at that time said the same thing. Coal slug hits Milton. The next day it hit Sunbury. The Daily Adams ran it big. You don't have that kind of immediate dramatic sense with climate change, but it's still. And the other thing is our legislature become more partisan, and I'm not sure they do the job they should in evaluating what they should be doing to solve these problems. So I don't give up hope that it couldn't pass, but the circumstances are not what they were then. I do think one thing is left. I do think the public strongly supports environmental protection. The public and is reflected in the legislature.
Yeah, it's not like you can take the issue of climate change and dip your jar into it and show like, hey, here's concrete looking evidence of things.
Right. You can't hold up 2 jars of water, one clean and the other apparently clean.
Right.
I mean, It's not like the water was. You couldn't do the same thing with air. So it's not quite as dramatic, but I think the legislature will eventually deal with it, because every legislator in the state of Pennsylvania and every public official in Pennsylvania takes an oath of office to uphold the Constitution. In fact, you cannot serve, even if you're elected, you cannot serve till you take the oath of office.
Mm-hmm.
And that means the oath to carry out and uphold Article 1, Section 27, which is what this environmental amendment became.
You definitely touched on this as we were talking, but talk to me about the strength of an amendment to the Constitution versus legislation. What gives an amendment more teeth than just a piece of legislation?
Well, first of all, it's harder to pass. It's got to go through 2 sessions of the legislature,
Okay.
and then be approved by the public. And to repeal it, you'd have to do the same thing. It stands above above statutes. I mean, take the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment is you can't have the right to free speech or freedom of religion. Well, that's something that's way up there. Congress couldn't stop that. They can only implement it. Same thing in Pennsylvania with the environmental rights. It's up there as part of our constellation of bill of ideals. You know, Pennsylvania has a Bill of Rights. It's Article 1 of the state constitution. That has a right to free speech, political freedom, and political association. Number 27 is the amendment on the environment. So it's something the courts can look to. And the other thing it does, it gives people the right to go to court to challenge what the government's doing if they think is being violated. And that has happened now several times since my amendment was adopted.
Okay. So now 50 years later, what do you feel is the greatest impact of this amendment?
Well, the greatest impact of the amendment is people now and companies and the state has to pay some attention to what it does when it affects the environment. You know, companies that are going to do something like build a dam or roadways through the water have got to get permits. They've got to figure out in advance what this will do to the environment. They never had to do that before. I think as people feel strong, this is really believe in it and know this means the legislature should act to do something about climate change. So I think that it's in people's minds, and it should be in legislators' minds. So I think it's really given us a set of ideals to work towards.
How about personally, 50 years later, how do you feel about your impact? Do you look back with pride?
Oh, yes. First of all, I'm amazed that I'm still alive. I never dreamed.
How old are you now?
84.
Okay.
Now, I never dreamed, Justin, when I ran for the House of Representatives in 1966. I had no thoughts of any constitutional amendments. I just wanted to win the seat. There was a lot of competitor in me. I wanted to beat the guy and win. Well, I did, but I had no idea anything I did in the legislature would be so absurd 50 years later. But as I got there, I spent my second and third terms. It evolved, and that's how it happened. And I look back, and my God, I'm amazed that I'm alive, but I'm really happy. It gives me more satisfaction than anything I did in public life. So I feel really good about it.
That's great to hear. And you did also touch on this a little bit too, but we can go back to it. I'm curious about your thoughts on the future of environmental law. Because there's been some proposals for a Green New Deal. The president has made addressing climate change a priority of his administration, both of which has some partisan opposition. Where do you think we go from here, and what will it take to bring everybody, or at least more people, on board?
Well, there is no question that climate change is a great and immediate threat to our continued survival here on the planet Earth. I say follow the science. All the scientists say we have maybe till 2050 to straighten out all these emissions into the air if we're going to be able to live here on this planet. So we got to start doing. So I think what President Biden's doing with his proposals is the right idea. Now,
Okay.
the opposition, that may be, but I think he's leading in the right direction. The one thing Biden has not offered, which I would like to offer, I think Pennsylvania's Article 1, Section 27 should be offered as an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is silent on the environment, and it's long overdue. And I think something like that would do the same thing for the country it's done for Pennsylvania, and would put our country and our government on the right side of the environment going into the future. And it would definitely help on the fight against the climate change.
Do you think there's a way to get everybody, or at least more people, on board with those ideas?
Well, yes, we have to keep talking about them.
Okay.
As you know, I published a book. It's called The Constitutional Question to Save the Planet, the People's Right to a Healthy Environment. Do you have the book?
I ordered it yesterday, so it's in the mail.
Well, I'm glad to know it's there. Let me just take one moment here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a second. Here's what it looks like. Did you see that?
Yeah, I did. Hold it up a little bit. Yep, a little bit further. Yeah, I can
All
see
right.
it.
Well, this book, and I don't want to sound too commercial, but I work with a publisher to keep the price to less than $20, so it's only $19.95. But we're trying to publicize the book. More important is the idea in the book. The ideas are more important than I am or anybody else. It's the idea that counts. That we need to pledge ourselves to the idea that our healthy environment is a fundamental right of human beings, just like freedom of religion or freedom of speech. And I add to that, what good is freedom of speech or freedom of religion if we're going to suffocate her on this planet? And that's what we're going to do.
Right.
If climate change is not stopped, all the emissions into the air are not controlled. So I think people are going to get around to it. We have to keep talking about it, pushing it. And I think it's the idea of a national amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Let me say this, but the U.S. Constitution was drafted originally in 1787. It was silent on several things. It was silent on slavery.
Right.
It was silent on women. It was silent on the environment. Now, less than 100 years later, the Civil War took place. And we got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which dealt with slavery and the rights of blacks to be as equal as whites. But that wasn't in the original Constitution. Take women's rights. They were nothing. The gentlemen who did the Constitution were great, but they were all males. They didn't have any women involved. But right after the Civil War, there was a struggle began. Why not have women have the same rights as men? Well, it took almost 100 years, but in 1919, thanks to the courage of a lot of women, the 19th Amendment gave women the same rights as men. Now, I think it's long overdue to break the silence of the Constitution on the environment and declare that a clean environment is a fundamental right of every American.
Let me share a couple photos with you here. So back in 2016, the state dedicated a portion of the Shikellamy State Park in your name. Curry Point is located at the southern tip of Packer Island at the confluence of the west and north branches of the Susquehanna River. So, there you are with a couple of the local state legislators.
I can't see it. I gotta. Oh, there it is. Yeah.
Yeah, you're there with Fred Keller, who's now the
Congressman. Yeah.
Yeah. Linda's there.
Yeah, Linda Schlegel Culver. Yeah, it's a great.
John Gordner. That's your wife, and I believe that's the secretary of the DCNR next to your wife, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's Cindy Dunn, and I think it's the John Gordner, the senator there. I think.
Yep, he's there as well. And then so this is the plaque, or not that's the plaque, but the sign that they have there for you. And then there's you and your wife. Her name's Elizabeth, right?
Elizabeth, yes.
Yeah, there you are at the point.
Yeah,
I was there that day. These are my pictures. You were obviously there that day. What was running through your mind, as they dedicated that area to you?
Well, I was absolutely amazed, and flabbergasted. I never dreamed, as I said, when I ran for the House, anything like this would ever happen. So I'm very grateful and honored, and all I can say is thank the good Lord that all this happened.
Do you ever stand, along the river and look across the water and think about how your actions have influenced the beauty that you're looking at?
Oh, once in a while I do.
Okay.
Matter of fact, I'll tell you one thing. I live in a housing development down here in Hummelstown, and about 200 yards away, there's a big stormwater drainage ditch where the stormwater goes in the heavy rains. So it's backed up and then dripped and drains slowly into the streams rather than going out as a flash flood. Whereas it's like a miniature dam that works only when it's heavy rain. I think of that because one of the things I did in the Senate was get a stormwater bill through to make developers hold back water from heavy rain so it doesn't just cause a flash flood downstream.
Mm-hmm.
That and the clean water, yeah, I take great pride in all. I feel good about what I did in the legislature.
All right. That's all the time we have. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Justin, I'm delighted and honored and wish you well up in Sunbury.
Thanks for watching One on One. Be sure to tune in next week for another edition.